Greetings everyone and welcome to Theology 621, Lecture 2a, where I want to say a few words about sources for Jesus' life as a foreword to talking about the synoptic problem, which deals with one of those hypothetical sources, namely the sayings document Q. We'll start with getting the basic facts on the table once again. We've got Jesus active in Palestine, in Galilee, in the early 30s. And we've got Gospels. You all are familiar with at least Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, written sometime between the 60s and the 90s. And somehow, if they're not inventing everything from whole cloth, they've got traditions that stem from Jesus to them, and this is the transmission of the sayings and stories about Jesus that we want to focus on primarily today. Obviously, some of this is transmitted by eyewitnesses. After all, Jesus had followers, and they must have told some stories about Jesus. And they must have related both episodes. One time there was a woman accused of adultery, and then this happened. And they will also have related sayings. The Lord said, quote, "Moses says to you, but I say." One of the questions we'll want to deal with is how tightly, when things are being transmitted, how much is the context of each of those sayings firmly grounded? In other words, if you think about something like the Sermon on the Mount, you've got very similar sayings in Matthew and in Luke, but Luke has them scattered about at different occasions. That would seem to suggest that while people remembered the sayings with some good degree of accuracy, they weren't sure that all those sayings happened at a single time in a single long sermon on a mountain. Luke, in fact, puts a lot of them on a level plane and puts a lot of the other sayings at different points in Jesus' life. Probably that means that while the sayings were remembered with some care, it wasn't always remembered when or where or to whom Jesus had said them. That point will become increasingly clear when we look at the synoptic problem. Now, at some point, clusters of sayings got gathered together, and the hypothetical document Q is one such collection of Jesus' sayings. The Gospel of Thomas is another illustration where you have 114 sayings with very little narrative connecting them. There's just one saying and then another and then another. There's no introduction, there's no birth narrative, there's no crucifixion at the end, just sayings. Q would be an example of that sort of collection of sayings. It's of course always possible that prior to Mark, someone else had tried to write a story with a beginning and a middle and an end. That's an open question which we can talk about on another occasion. One of the points that's important to make in this talk about sources for Jesus' life is that by and large, things were transmitted orally. So throughout this whole period, we need to be reckoning with oral transmission. This is both for practical and obvious reasons, namely, almost everyone in the ancient world was illiterate. Estimates of literacy in antiquity usually hover around 10%. It's possible that literacy among Jews was a bit higher because of the priority Jews put on the law of Moses and on training in the synagogue, but even then, no one estimates that even among Jews, literacy was any higher than about 10 or 15%. So, as a matter of practicality, matters had to be related orally. But it's more than that, and I'll elaborate on this in a moment. In the ancient world, almost everyone, including people who could read and write, thought that oral tradition was more valuable than written tradition. I'll say more about that in a minute. Now, one of the misconceptions that tends to plague even New Testament scholarship, and certainly just popular conception, is that there was sort of an oral transmission. One person tells another, and maybe there's some eyewitnesses all the way down to the time of the Gospels. But then, that's the end of oral transmission. And then you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and there's no need for people to continue to tell stories. Well, given what I've just said about literacy, I hope that immediately strikes you as an implausible scenario. And in fact, it's not only implausible, but is demonstrably false. In fact, we need to wrestle with the fact that after the Gospels are written, oral transmission continues unabated. And if you were to poll Christians in the 2nd century, what they will say is, we're interested in knowing about Jesus. They simply quote things Jesus said, they relate stories that Jesus did, and they don't seem very anxious to say which gospel they read it in. So they'll just say, when the Lord saw a woman accused of adultery, or when the Lord was arguing with the Pharisees about the Sabbath, he said such and so. They don't specify which gospel they read that in, and they also quote lots of stuff that isn't in our gospels, and they don't treat it as esoteric or bizarre or outre in some way. They just treat it as things that their Lord taught and did, which they therefore care about. To me, this is important for a couple of reasons. One, just to understand the history of early Christianity. Secondly, because I think it's important to overcome a misconception that Christianity is nowadays called a religion of the book, along with Judaism and Islam. And at one level, that's true. Those three great religions have become religions of books in some ways. They become religions based around authoritative scripture. But at least for early Christians, and really this probably goes for the others as well, but I'll just speak about early Christianity, they're not that worried about the books per se until a slightly later period. And ironically, in the New Testament period, that is the time when the New Testament documents are being written, between the 40s and about the year 100, they're very much more interested in knowing who's an authorized teacher or who has reliable or spirit-inspired traditions or teachings, much more than saying, what book was that written in? We can show what this looks like in practice by thinking about an actual early 2nd century figure, like Papias. Writing about the year 115, we have a report from Papias, who is actually the earliest person to talk about the Gospel of Mark. Now, Papias credits Mark with being Peter's interpreter. This is often seized upon to uphold the value of Mark as a historical witness. Papias says that Mark was Peter's interpreter. That either means someone who interpreted what Peter said, or it means he was actually Peter's translator. That is, Peter would have been teaching in Aramaic, and Mark translated his sayings into Greek. One way or the other, Papias says that Mark passed on what Peter used to teach. We'll talk more about that quotation in a minute. But what is interesting is that Papias also says there were other human beings alive, whom he calls usually the elders, and they passed on the things that Peter and the other disciples used to teach. And there's a few interesting points here. One is that he is clear to say that he only trusted things that were certified as true. He wasn't interested in anyone who could tell any old story about Jesus. So he's aware that there is better and worse tradition, or sayings and so on. It's not all equal. He is somewhat discriminating. But at the same time, when it comes down to choosing between the written Gospel of Mark, even though he thinks it's connected to Jesus' disciple Peter, he says, I preferred the living and abiding voice of the elders, because I didn't suppose that I could benefit as much from what came out of a book as from a living and abiding voice. What he says about the elders is that whenever any of these people came about who were companions with the apostles, I would carefully inquire after their words, and I would ask them what Andrew said, or Peter, or Philip, or Thomas, or James, or John, or Matthew, or any of the other disciples of the Lord. So in the early 2nd century, even someone who thinks Mark has reliably translated Jesus' chief apostles' writings, or chief apostles' teaching, he prefers the sayings of the elders who have also passed on the material from Jesus' disciples. Papias actually writes the church's first exegesis paper. In 5 volumes, he writes an exposition or interpretation of the sayings of the Lord. But note here, he doesn't write an exegesis of the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Matthew, which he also talks about. He writes an exposition of the sayings. That's what was more important to him. And he's not uncommon in that regard. Throughout the 2nd century, what you'll generally find are these 2 things in common. One is a belief that oral transmission is more trustworthy than written transmission. Second, a genuinely discriminating interest in sifting out what is reliable from what is make-believe, and that's important. Early Christians, although they would include things that strike us as fabulous, they were aware that it was important to be talking to someone who knew Jesus' followers, not just anyone. That was different than someone just inventing a story. And I guess third, I would add, the interest is in as much as you can say about Jesus as possible. And so even when the Gospels are written, that's not the end of passing along oral transmission. I'll just illustrate some of the sorts of sayings that are passed along, some of which have survived in written form. So you get some sense of sayings that aren't included in the canonical Gospels that were being used in the early church. This is Papyrus Egerton II from the 2nd century, and you get a quotation here. Jesus is having some sort of dispute with the lawyers, and you'll see that some of the words, search the scriptures, in which you think that you have life, but these are the ones which bear witness to me. That sounds a bit like the Gospel of John. It's not exactly like John. Well, why would it be sort of like and sort of unlike John? Probably because when the Gospel of John is writing, John, this author, is drawing on sayings that this papyrus was also drawing on. In a similar way, Pioxy 840, we have the Savior engaging in some sort of argument about blind men who cannot see. It has to do with ritual purity. The Savior here accuses the others of washing in water which dogs and pigs have used. They merely scrub the outer, but their inner is filled with all sorts of nastiness. And Jesus says, my disciples and I have bathed in living water which comes down from heaven. This saying sounds both a little like the Gospel of Mark, with disputes about what truly cleanses, and a bit like the Gospel of John, with talk of living water and of water which comes down from heaven. We could multiply examples like this, but this is the sort of thing that Christians valued. It's not exactly like Mark, it's not exactly like John. It doesn't derive its authority from a written gospel. It derives its authority because the Savior said it. To make one last point about oral tradition, I said that Christians are mainly interested in sayings, and they're mainly interested in what is spoken. In terms of what is spoken, this is a prejudice in favor of orality going back at least as far as Socrates. In Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, we have Thoth offering the king the new invention, the new technology called writing. And to quote here, he says, in this instance, you who are the father of letters, of writing, from a paternal love of your children, you've been led to attribute to them a quality which they cannot have. For this discovery of yours, of writing, will create forgetfulness in their souls. Socrates famously calls writing the drug, the medicine of forgetfulness. They won't use their memories anymore, he says. They will trust this external written character and won't know it themselves. What you've discovered is not an aid to memory, but an aid to forgetting. They will be hearers of many things and learners of nothing. They will become tiresome company who have the show of wisdom without the reality. What would Socrates say if he could see Google now, where none of us learns anything anymore because we can always just look it up later? This is an ancient prejudice against writing, and suffice it to say Christians share it. So we've already quoted Papias saying that it's more important to have a living and abiding voice. We have the 2nd century Christian scholar Clement of Alexandria saying real wisdom is a living tradition of ineffable teachings, things that can't even be spoken, entrusted to logos, not to writing. To give an example of the sort of way Christians continue to pass on this oral tradition, to continue here with Clement of Alexandria, who I just mentioned, he's engaging in a debate, and he refers to something that the Lord said to Salome, when you trample underfoot the shell of shame, and when the two become one, and the male is one with the female, and there is no more male and female. And you think, where on earth did he find this? Well, he says he found it written in the Gospel of the Egyptians. But what's striking is that this saying appears also, something very similar to it, in 2 Clement, a 2nd century sermon from Rome, that is a preacher just quotes what the Lord said, when the two become one, and the male is the one with the female. And this same saying appears in the Gospel of Thomas. Now, these authors aren't quoting Thomas, and Thomas isn't quoting them. This is just an example of the sort of saying of the Lord that continued to circulate outside the Gospels. We see things like this in the New Testament itself. Think of Paul teaching in the book of Acts. His last words to the elders at Ephesus is, "Remember what the Lord Jesus himself taught. It is more blessed to give than to receive." You, of course, won't find that in any of the written Gospels, but Luke, who wrote his own Gospel, doesn't think that's a big concern. After all the Gospel writers, just bear in mind, I'm not saying anything negative about the Gospel writers. They themselves make clear, John the clearest of all, there are many other things that Jesus did, and they aren't all contained in a book. They can't be. So the Gospel of John is meant to represent trustworthy tradition about Jesus, but not to be exhaustive. It's not all the tradition about Jesus. It's not only the case that in the early 2nd century, people were particularly interested in any sort of living tradition about Jesus, but the written text of the Gospels themselves was still evolving. And I don't want to overstate this, because I think sometimes in the popular imagination, there's the idea that somehow our textual witnesses to the Gospels are wildly inaccurate and something somehow created in the Middle Ages or involved with some sort of papal conspiracy. That's not the case. By and large, the texts we have, the Greek texts we have, are quite close to what was originally written. But there were additions and subtractions made, mainly additions. I'll just give a couple illustrations. Let's take the Gospel of Luke. And an example of the way that oral transmission could interfere with even written texts. So let's take a saying from the Gospel of Luke. Luke 6, 5, and 6. We have a series of Sabbath controversies. Jesus continues one debate by saying, "And the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." And then Luke includes another Sabbath story. And on another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and taught, and we get more Sabbath stuff. But in a certain codex, in Codex Bezae, right in between this series of Sabbath controversies, Codex Bezae inserts an additional saying. On that day, Jesus saw a man working on the Sabbath, and he said to him, "Man, if you know what you're doing, you're blessed. But if you don't know, you are accursed and a trespasser of the law." What an interesting saying. It looks like a saying meant to correct a sort of libertine attitude toward the Sabbath by people who were flaunting their freedom and didn't really know why they were flaunting their freedom. That saying survives only in Codex Bezae, but it's an illustration of the way some sort of saying attributed to Jesus, whether or not he actually said this one, could be inserted into the written text of our Gospels. And to give an example I've already alluded to before of the woman caught in adultery, this famous story is actually added to the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Luke in two different places in different manuscripts. And when early Christians quote this story, when they refer to it, they say it's something that was written in the Gospel of the Hebrews. Here surely is a case of Christians knowing this story, valuing this story, and concluding, well, we ought to put it in one of the Gospels, and so they put it actually in more than one of the Gospels, and in different places in different Gospels. I've been emphasizing here that Christians in the early 2nd century continued to be interested in oral transmission of sayings, and even when they had the written Gospels, they quoted them not as it is written in the Holy Gospel of Matthew, but simply a saying of Jesus. I got it in Matthew, I got it in Luke, I got it in John. I don't care where I got it. I just want to know about Jesus. The question that raises itself then is, why did these four Gospels ultimately become canonical? What set them apart from the myriad of other Gospels that were soon to be written? Well, we'll say more about this in the concluding lecture of the semester when we talk about canonicity, but it's important to say a few words at this point. First of all, we could take something like the Gospel of Mark, and as we said, it's already going to have a certain authority because of the tradition that it is reliable because, in a manner of speaking, it's reliable because Mark was Peter's interpreter, and Peter is a follower of Jesus. To just focus on Mark and the earliest witness for it being an interpreter of Mark being an interpreter of Peter, we have this from our man again, Papias, Bishop of Hierapolis. Papias says that one of these elders he liked to interview, that is, one of the people who knew the apostles, one of these elders told him that Mark was Peter's interpreter. Mark was not himself a follower of Jesus, but Peter would give Jesus' teachings as anecdotes, crai. We'll say more about that, but that means a little form of a saying, a little joke. And Mark then did nothing wrong by writing down what he recalled. Note the form that Papias says that in. He wants to defend Mark. Were there people who were accusing Mark of doing something wrong by writing down the gospel? It's possible. It's possible that people felt that it should have been kept as oral tradition. But Papias says, no, that's fine. And in Papias' view, Mark was not written in an orderly way. It's not a particularly elegant document, but Mark's goal was simply to contain everything, not to omit or falsify. All right, so far so good from Mark. We have Mark via Peter to Jesus. So Mark's authority derives from its proximity to Jesus. Likewise, in the case of Matthew, something like Matthew is, of course, named as one of Jesus' disciples. So Matthew's authority will derive from its being arguably composed by a follower of Jesus. The problem that that criterion raises is that there are a lot of other gospels circulating under the names of Jesus' disciples. There's a Gospel of Thomas. In fact, there are two Gospels of Thomas. There's an infancy Gospel of Thomas as well, which we'll read shortly. There's a Gospel by Jesus' apostle Bartholomew. There's the Gospel of the Egyptians. That's not an apostle, but that was an important one. There's a Gospel by Jesus' mother, by Philip, by Judas, and so on and so forth. And when it comes to having tradition from someone who's Peter's interpreter, people said that a guy named Glaucius was one of Peter's other interpreters. And so the early Gnostic Basilides, this supposed arch heretic, says, wait, I'm not an arch heretic. I'm just passing on what I heard from Glaucius, who was Peter's interpreter. You can see the problem here. There's a lot of apostles. There's a lot of texts circulating under apostles' names. At this point, we would want to ask, how much do the early Christians actually know about someone like Matthew, a named apostle? I mean, is it trustworthy when they say he was one of Jesus' disciples? Well, we will be alarmed here because we have tradition about Matthew saying that Matthew was in Parthia, in Myrmidona, in Macedonia, in Palestine, no, in Phoenicia, he lived in Pisidian Antioch. I heard he lived in Hierapolis. No, Matthew was in Ethiopia. Matthew spent his time in Persia. That's a lot of different traditions. And that's going to lead people to say, wait, are we really sure that these four canonical texts have tighter links to Jesus than any of the other Gospels that are circulating? Well, it is true that by the end of the 2nd century, Christians who would later become the Orthodox movement, and by Orthodox here I mean lowercase o, what becomes Catholic and Protestant and Greek Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Orthodox as opposed to Gnostic or Jewish Christian. These sorts of Christians will say, we want four and only four. And the very reason they start to insist this is precisely because of the proliferation of Gospels and of traditions. So when at the end of the 2nd century, they begin to make this claim, four and only four, what's the basis for their claim? Well, the first person to make that claim is a guy named Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, and here's his argument. Of course there can only be four Gospels. Because think about it, there are four zones of the world, and there are four principal winds, and the church is scattered throughout the world, and the pillar of the ground of the church is the gospel, so there have to be four pillars, so there's four Gospels. That's Irenaeus' argument. And as you can tell by my tone of voice, this is not a compelling argument. The fact that that's the best Irenaeus can do, writing in the year 180, is a reminder that only toward the end of the 2nd century does this sort of innovation, he's innovating, does this innovation come about. And it doesn't have any really strong basis. Still well after Irenaeus, we have instances where there was a controversy over a community using the Gospel of Peter. And a bishop went to check on it, and he said, yeah, it's fine. Use the Gospel of Peter. It's fine with me. And then there was a further dust up, and so on and so forth. So we're in a period in the 2nd century when there is not a 4-gospel canon. What there are a variety of traditions, sayings, texts about Jesus, and people trying to sort out which they're going to use. All of this may lead you to feel like I'm trying to say the Gospels aren't reliable, our canonical Gospels aren't reliable, and that's not really my point. My point is that Christians, in fact, are interested in the question of reliability, but that was still an open question that had to be argued about. I just want to say a brief word here to try to allay certain misconceptions about ancient history writing, and that is to look at the preface of Luke's Gospel. Luke here writes in the form of the prefaces used for histories in the ancient world. And by doing so, he subjects himself to the standards of ancient history writing. Now, ancient history writing is different than modern history writing, but nonetheless, ancients were concerned, to quote another ancient historian, to figure out what was actually said and done. Doesn't mean they always got it right, but ancient historians constantly pick on each other and say, oops, I caught you in an anachronism. You said he went to the province of Macedonia. That wasn't a province yet. That was still the kingdom of such and so. So when Luke sets out in his preface here to say, I've done my investigations, I've checked with eyewitnesses, and I have tried to write up an orderly account so you can know the truth. He's trying to write accurate history. And he would then be laid open to the charge by someone else, wait, you got a date wrong, you got a ruler wrong. You said this happened in Jerusalem, but I think it happened in Galilee. The fact that Luke is trying to write history doesn't mean he gets everything right. I'll give some examples of things I think he probably gets wrong. But here's maybe just to paint in broad strokes. It does mean that Luke is trying to talk about things that took place in time and space. He's not merely trying to write mythology, which conveys timeless, abstract truths. A misconception, and here I'll quote a relatively recent textbook, a misconception is that ancients couldn't tell the difference between inventing stories and things that happened, and they thought things were true whether they happened or not. That's absolutely ridiculous. Go back 500 years before this. Plato, when he legislates for an ideal city, says, I will not let people like Homer in my ideal city because I don't want myths told to the young people, because those are lies. And more in the time of Luke, we have historians like Josephus, who is constantly distinguishing himself from other historians by saying, I can cite a witness, or when I relate this battle, I'm using the memoirs of so-and-so who was the general at that battle. Again, this doesn't show that Luke got everything right. It doesn't show that the other synoptics got everything right. They disagree with each other. But it means they were trying to. And what we will have to evaluate, episode by episode, incident by incident, saying by saying, is how successful were they? There's not time to do that in this lecture, but I just want to note that it is important to say the synoptics do not put on the lips of Jesus answers to all of their own questions. There were questions that Christians faced in the 70s and 80s that they would love to have an answer from Jesus from. And they don't simply create an answer and put it on Jesus' lips. Take the most divisive question of their time. were Gentiles who joined the Christian movement required to follow the law of Moses. They don't know what to do with that. They don't put it on Jesus' lips. After all, they admit, they recall that Jesus didn't have much to do with Gentiles. And in fact, he spoke badly of them and he told his followers not to deal with them. That can't have been any fun when the church was now a mixed community of Jews and Gentiles. But they maintain that saying in its original form, or something close to its original form. The Synoptic Gospels have Jesus say that Peter will be the leader, the rock upon which he builds his church. But in fact, who led the community in Jerusalem? His brother James did. Well, what does Jesus say about his brothers? Nothing good. Nothing good in the Gospels. That again is interesting. If they were simply trying to make the Gospels fit with how things actually unfolded, we would see a closer relationship there. Finally, there's all sorts of radical sayings. I'll say more about that. Christians pretty soon early on wanted to support what we might call traditional family values. Have a mom and a dad and an orderly household and so on and so forth. But Jesus says, hate your mother and father, and I've come to divide the family. They didn't like those sayings. They were embarrassed by them. They tried to explain them away, but the very fact that they kept them is interesting. And you don't find them ascribing to Jesus the sorts of ethics that they were actually living by. So they lived with the tension. And finally, they just maintain all sorts of awkward traditions. The fact that Jesus was from Nazareth was a great source of embarrassment. The prophecies are he's supposed to be from Bethlehem. Well, they concoct a way to get him born in Bethlehem, but they admit the guy's from Capernaum. He's from Nazareth in Galilee. They admit that his followers deserted him. This was immediately seized upon by opponents of Christianity as a source of humiliation and called into question all sorts of things. The Gospels maintain this sort of tradition. They maintain the fact that the witnesses of the empty tomb were frightened women. They keep all these sayings of Jesus that some of you standing here will not taste death. After the temple's been destroyed, after a generation has passed, it would have been very tempting to completely rewrite that sort of material, but they don't. That's not to say, so we're painting with a broad brush here. It's not to say that every saying you find in the Synoptic Gospels was said by Jesus as in the form we have it. It will become clear that's not what I think. But quite a lot of sayings are things they did not invent in the 70s when these Gospels are written. One other important point is that even when sayings are given radically new interpretations, the form of the saying is preserved by and large intact. I'll just give one example. In Matthew 7:6, we have Jesus saying in the Sermon on the Mount, don't take what is holy and give it to the dogs. He doesn't say what he means by that. In the Didache, this early sort of church order, set of instructions for baptism and ritual and so on, the Didache says, here's the rules. Nobody can eat the Eucharist who hasn't been baptized, because the Lord said, don't give what is holy to the dogs. Now, that's certainly not what Jesus meant by that saying. It's a reapplication of the saying. But what's important to note is that the saying itself is preserved intact. And that tends to be true in the Gospels. What you'll find in the Synoptic Gospels is even when a saying is redeployed in a new context, the saying is preserved with some fidelity. To draw some very broad conclusions of things we will be teasing out, and not all these conclusions point in the same direction, but broad conclusions to prepare for the semester of investigating this stuff. 1. Apropos the question of sources for Jesus' life. 1. Sayings did circulate independently of the literary contexts we have them in now. In other words, when it says in Luke that Jesus said this because he was making his way to Jerusalem, and then Matthew has the same saying after Jesus is in Jerusalem, you've got pretty good reason to believe that originally that saying was passed along and no one was really sure where he was when he said it. We'll get more examples of that principle later on. 2. Singular sayings were subject to diverse interpretations. What did Jesus mean when he said, every sin can be forgiven except for blasphemy against the Holy Spirit? Short answer, nobody ever had any idea. I don't know. I've never read any plausible explanation. It's not clear that the Gospels have any idea, but they still report the saying. And even when there are sayings that are interpreted, The interpretations often differ. 3, Christians do invent things out of nothing about Jesus. That may sound like it contradicted what I said earlier about history writing, but it shouldn't. Just because you claim to write history doesn't mean you're getting everything right. And if you are uncomfortable saying this about the canonical Gospels, all you have to do is look no further than extra-canonical sources. Read the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which we're going to read in 2 weeks, and you will see a bunch of things about Jesus, confidently asserted about Jesus, that I bet you don't think are actually true. I certainly don't think are actually true. That at least has to remind us, if Christians could invent that and ascribe it to the little boy Jesus, how do we know that Luke isn't inventing something from whole cloth when he says certain things about Jesus? He might be. 4, some Gospels were written in a completely different key. And I just mentioned John here, or Thomas. Luke is trying to write a history. He names who was governor, who was leader, and so on and so forth. He wants to follow the conventions of ancient Hellenistic and Roman history. The Gospel of John is a different kettle of fish. And it's not to say that John doesn't also contain some interesting early reminiscences, because it probably does. But John doesn't have a preface like Luke's preface. John, in a sense, just says, let me do this in a different way. And early on, already in the 2nd century, Christians were saying, John is the spiritual gospel. It's not so much written to convey the reporting of the facts. It's written to convey the significance of the sorts of things Jesus did. And 5, again, ancients were well aware of the difference between inventing something and reporting it. And so they did ask questions like, who told you that? Do you have that from someone who saw Jesus, or are you 2 steps removed? And by and large, they tried to be careful and sort out, can we trace this back to someone who is an eyewitness or who heard from an eyewitness? Are there obvious historical implausibilities? And so when we have something, let's say, like the genealogies in Matthew and in Luke, those genealogies disagree. The ancient Christians don't just say about that, well, they just all tell the truth at a spiritual level. Actually, the ancient Christians set about early on to trying to explain how to harmonize those genealogies. We can decide whether they were successful, but the point is, they did think that although the events and sayings in Jesus' life had extra significance and could be unpacked for timeless eternal truths, they were interested in the particulars of what happened when and so on.